you were mentioning about Paul's comments in 1 Corinthians 7. So the implication would be, if you don't marry, you also would not be having children. And so there are some who are given that gift for following the Lord, for building up his kingdom, and that is another way of worshiping the Lord. It's the exception, though. I mean, I would say he intends for more people to marry and have them, but you're not somehow less of a person.
Yeah. So it seems like an odd question, but I think sometimes there can be that mentality. And I think in American churches where actually higher rates of people have children than the general population, there can be a perception that effectively you're incomplete. There's something wrong with you if you don't have kids. But, I mean, you mentioned Adam and Eve didn't have kids at first, and they were God glorifying in their state originally. But Jesus likewise, obviously. Jesus was single. Jesus, contrary to what the Da Vinci Code might teach you, Jesus did not get married. Jesus did not have children. He was single, and not only was he fully God, he was fully man. He was complete man. He was the essence of total manhood. Not like total manhood like a ridiculous commercial, but total humanity. And again, I think it needs to be stated, I don't think that under the new covenant that these commands to have children are necessarily binding upon Christians. But I do think it needs to be stated, I very much think not having kids for your own enjoyment is selfish. I think it's good and wise for some people to not have children for the sake of kingdom living. And I can think of, as a pastor who has kids, who has a wife, there are ways in which I'm limited. I know of a pastor who's single, actually in England, that I've listened to a lot of his, and he mentions ways in which he can do ministry that I just simply can't, that I don't have the opportunities to because I'm responsible to discipling my little ones. And I think for him, that person, as well as some other people, not having kids so that they can better reach people and serve God's kingdom is wonderful and fine and God glorifying if that's legitimately your reason. But I think for the majority of people that intentionally don't have kids, I think it tends to be for the sake of building their own kingdom rather than for the sake of building God's kingdom. And I think that is selfish. And I would probably even go so far as saying that that's actually sinful.
I think you're right. I think often the cases will just, kids, they're so inconvenient, whatever. And so it is about building their own kingdom. There's less fun. I can't go to the trendy restaurants I like. I got to take care of the kid. I can't play, golf or disc golf or whatever it is you want to go do. Like the children, they do inconvenience you. You can't just go and do as you please, or you ought not to. I mean, I hear of people who do, but your responsibilities do change, and so your schedule should as well.
Yes, that's right. So, and how do those without their own biological kids, or those or even adopted kids, value children?
Well, just by not looking down on them or viewing them as inherently inconvenient, going out of their way to love them. I mean, Jesus received children. This is a single man without his own children, receiving kids with humility and love and enthusiasm. I mean, if he did it, why not you? And so that doesn't – I mean, there could be practical ways of if people – whether it's children in your extended family, your church family, saying, hey, I'll watch the kids for you, or, just investing in their lives and not viewing them just as, the kids. They're just – they're there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to a little bit spin in a corny way a statement that's famous. Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, she wrote a book on the term, It Takes a Village to Raise a Child. And I'm not sure I agree with all of her premises in it. But, I mean, she basically states that
it takes a government to raise a child.
It takes a government. But it takes society. I mean, it can't just be one family in isolation raising a child. And I think she's right, kind of, because I think it takes a church to raise a child. I think it takes a community of believers to raise a child. And so I can think of a there was at a previous church I was at, there was a retired woman who did not have any children. And didn't have any children of her own, and kind of became a Christian a little bit later in life than some other people did. And this woman really that was dedicated to serving children of that church in really incredible ways. And she, she was sometimes felt like, she wasn't really up to the task, but she really glorified God and helped parents by loving on kids in incredible ways. And, I think of, actually, a loved one of mine went out of the way on a Mother's Day celebration to actually really celebrate this woman for making an impact, for discipling and impacting the next generation, and kind of in a way acting really as a mother, following that real motherhood instinct, even though she didn't have her own biological children. And God is so glorified in that. And ultimately, if Jesus served without kids, Jesus served kids without having his own kids. And if that's the case, so should you if you don't have your own kids. Not having your own kids is never an excuse not to serve children. And this attitude sometimes that children's ministry is for those who have their own kids. It's for those who have their own kids to kind of carry the load between each other. It's just unbiblical and unchristian, I think.
I know. I mean, when I got married, I think I viewed children somewhat biblically, but I had to come to grips with the Lord showed me that I was viewing children more like the world's way of thinking than I wanted to admit initially. And, I think this can often be the case, though not always, but my wife was ready to have children earlier than I was. And, I was thinking about finances, we were in seminary and things were very tight financially, but it didn't all come down to that. And so, I did have to repent of ways that I had just sort of soaked in the culture's view of kids.
Yeah. Do you think this means, though, that we should each have 50 kids? Do you think that we need to put our wives through bearing 50 kids each?
Anyway, but I think there are other factors to consider. I don't think there's this mandate to have as many children as you are physically able to. And it comes to also the purpose of marriage. Is every act of marital intimacy, is that intended to produce a child? Well, while some would argue differently, I don't think so. One thing, just because you can't conceive realistically every time. If the woman's not ovulating, or if post ovulation and post menopause and that kind of thing. So that's not the only purpose of that within marriage. So I think there's a lot of other factors that go in, but no, I don't think that you have to have just cranking them out like a factory.
Yeah. Yeah, I think in most cases, doing the 20 or 50 kids actually is probably unwise. I'm not going to say all, but I would say, I'm not going to say sin, but I would say unwise in some cases. But we definitely don't have to have a whole bunch of kids. We definitely don't have to become quiverfuls, as some people call them among evangelicals. But in fact, I think that family planning is very much within biblical reason. I don't think there's anything sinful or unbiblical about family planning that doesn't involve killing a child, of course. So I think every couple, every family needs to make a decision, but make a decision for the sake of the glory of God. A decision that seeks to honor and glorify the Lord, rather than just a decision that's necessarily what's easy and what's most beneficial for your family now. But I think sometimes that can mean less. I think sometimes ministry families and those really serving in church, maybe even as an elder or a deacon, can feel that if they had 12 or 15 kids, it's going to limit what they can do for the kingdom in that way, or unless they be an unfit parent. And I think other cases, people might feel like it's really glorifying to God for them to have a lot of kids, even though it means they can't do certain things.
Yeah, and there's physical issues that can factor in there. With a woman's body, pregnancy does sort of tear down the body over time, and so that can be something to, that would be unloving, I think. Just to, well, no, with just throwing everything else out and say, well, no, God wants us to have kids. And so even though, honey, this is tearing your body down, we're just going to keep doing this. I think that's just not being, living with according to understanding, with your wife, 1 Peter 3. But that's between, and I guess that's an issue for the wife to reckon with the Lord. But there's just a whole lot of factors that go into it. I mean, financial considerations too. I don't think it's a lack of faith. It's, you make X amount of dollars, and so I don't know that we can feed 10 mouths with this.
Yeah.
I think that can be loving to those kids and those potential kids that might be coming. It could be loving to other people around you because you're less dependent on them. So
yeah. Well, and I think it is so interesting to think through that because, I mean, in the past societies, oftentimes having a lot of kids was how you fed those mouths inherently. Because, you put your 12-year-old Johnny to work. You got to work that farm. Now you go to jail for that. So, but what does our society think of large families? And how do you think the Bible compares to that?
I think most of the time they're viewed as Fruit Loops. What about the money? How are you going to pay for all those kids? What about the time with them? And I have to be careful. I mean, I know a few pretty large families, and sometimes I do wonder, practically speaking, how some of those things work out. But I think it just depends on the family, but and their circumstances. But yeah, I think by and large, society thinks they're nuts, but the Bible affirms it. Again, I mean, was it Psalm 127?
Yeah.
The children are a heritage; they're a blessing from the Lord.
Fill your quiver full of them.
What's that?
I mean, literally does say. I mean, the quiverful movement comes from that passage, even though I don't agree with it. But yeah, blessed the man who fills his quiver with them. Yeah.
And so there is just explicit teaching that they are viewed, and it talks about your wife being, a fruitful vine, children all around the table, and it's a sign of God's favor. And so God has given you these image bearers to, and we're going to get into this in a minute, but what we can learn from children and the benefit that they do bring to us. And so the Bible does, like with so many things, it pushes up against cultural assumptions, and not just Western ones. It's pushing. I mean, the call to love them, to love wives, and to cherish and nurture. Like the same word for cherish that I just mentioned is used for wives and for children in Ephesians 5 and into 6. Yeah. And so, just as Christ loves and nurtures His church, husbands and fathers who do that to these weaker vessels, and so. It's pushing up that was countercultural for them. The Bible has the Bible's just an equal opportunity offender.
It is, yes. I think you're so right on that. And I actually think that society even goes further than just thinking that they're weird. I think sometimes that there's an attitude increasingly that large families are bad for the world. I mean, it's just not just weird, it's wrong. It's responsible for overpopulation, and you're going to mess up all your kids if you have a huge family.
It's contributing to climate change, and what are we going to eat?
Oh, exactly. Yeah, and I think sometimes there's somewhat of a Christian attitude along those lines, not necessarily climate change one, but that it's weird and that it's wrong. And I've known of cases where that even church leaders have actively told people you don't need to have that many kids. I mean, that's a problem. But you have no right. We have no right to discourage. From a biblical perspective, we have no right to look down upon or ever discourage those Christians that make the decision to have large families. In fact, I think we as Christians must come alongside large families. We must encourage and help them. And we also must understand their limitations, that I think sometimes people can be frustrated. The dad of a whole bunch of kids is not going to be serving as much as the dad the retired dad or the dad of one or two kids. That's okay. We have to understand that. We have to understand that the mom of a whole bunch of kids is going to be tired tired. And our responsibility as Christians is to bear one another's burdens. And sometimes for the family of big, a lot of kids, even if you don't agree with their approach, come alongside and be